Everyone in the Choi household believed Adais had no secrets left. They were wrong. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m., a number Do-yeon didn't recognize, saved under a name that meant nothing to him. She answered it in the garden, in a whisper. And for the first time in 3 years of marriage, Do-yeon Choi didn't know his own wife. The Choi estate in Seoul was quiet at night, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel like a confession. Do-yeon had learned, over years of running his family's shipping empire, an empire whose real cargo few dared to name, that silence was never empty. Silence was where the truth hid. He found Adais in the garden, phone pressed to her ear, her voice low enough that the wind nearly swallowed it. She didn't hear him approach. "I told you not to call this number," she said. "Not here, not now." Do-yeon stopped at the edge of the stone path, his shadow long under the security lights. Something in her tone, not fear, not guilt, but urgency, unsettled him more than either would have. She turned, saw him, and ended the call without a goodbye. "Who was that?" he asked. His voice was calm. It always was. Calm was how the men in his world learned to be dangerous. "No one," she said. "An old friend." He didn't believe her. He didn't say so. Later that night, lying beside her in the dark, Do-yeon stared at the ceiling and thought of the one rule he'd never broken in his marriage. He had never gone through her phone. He wondered for the first time if that rule had protected her more than it had protected them. He didn't know it yet, but that single phone call was the first thread of a lie 3 years in the making, and pulling it would unravel everything he thought he knew about the woman he married. Do-yeon said nothing for 2 days. That was his way. Observe, gather, wait. It was how he'd survived boardrooms that doubled as battlefields. How he'd survived a father who taught him that the first man to react was always the first man to lose. But watching Adais grew harder every hour. She was distracted. She checked her phone before it rang, as if bracing for something. On the third night, he asked his most trusted man, Mr. Han, who handled matters Do-yeon couldn't be seen handling himself, to trace the number. The report came back with only partial information. A phone registered in Lagos, Nigeria. No name. A prepaid line. Untraceable beyond that point. "Someone who doesn't want to be found," Han said. Do-yeon didn't tell his wife what he'd done. He wasn't proud of it. But some truths, he told himself, a husband was owed. That night, Adais came to him differently. Soft, searching, as if trying to close a distance she alone could feel widening. He didn't ask about the call. He let her come closer instead, and for a few hours, suspicion gave way to something older between them, a need neither wanted to name in daylight. But in the morning, her phone buzzed once, a text. She read it, and her face changed in a way she couldn't hide fast enough. Do-yeon said nothing about what he'd seen in her expression, but he now understood. Whoever was calling from Lagos wasn't a stranger to her at all, and whatever she was protecting him from, it had already begun to cost her. It was Han who found it, tucked in the lining of a bag Adais rarely used, a bag she kept locked in the back of her closet. A single photograph, old and creased, of a man standing outside a house in Lagos. Written on the back, in handwriting that wasn't hers, "For when you're ready to come home." Do-yeon stared at the photograph for a long time before he understood what disturbed him most. It wasn't the man's face. It was how young Adais looked beside him in the image, and how the man's arm was placed around her shoulder with the ease of someone who had once belonged there. He didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, he asked the question that had been building in him for days. "Adais, before Seoul, before me, who were you?" She went still in a way that told him more than any answer could. "You wouldn't understand," she said quietly. "Some things I left behind on purpose. Then help me understand." She looked at him, really looked, like she was deciding whether he could survive what came next. "There are things from Lagos," she finally said, "that I never wanted to follow me here. But they found me anyway. Do-yeon believed, in that moment, that he was finally close to the truth. He had no idea the real secret wasn't in Lagos at all. It was standing inside his own company, closer to him than he could imagine. Han's next report didn't come by phone. It came in person. Late. The kind of late that meant the news inside it couldn't wait for morning. Do-yeon met him in the private study on the second floor, the one room in the estate where his father's portrait still hung above the fireplace, watching every conversation like a silent shareholder. Han placed a thin folder on the desk and said nothing at first, which, from a man who never wasted words, felt like its own kind of warning. "The number from Lagos," Han said finally. "It isn't connected to a lover. I want to be clear about that before you read anything else." Do-yeon exhaled, though he hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath for 2 days straight. Then who? Her brother? Emeka Obi? The name meant nothing to Do-yeon, not yet. He opened the folder expecting a simple family history, some estranged sibling story that explained the secrecy and nothing more. Instead, the second page stopped him cold. A shipping manifest. His family's company letterhead. A name flagged in red ink, cross-referenced with an internal memo dated 2 years before his marriage to Adaze. A memo authorized, he now saw, by his own father. "This can't be right," Do-yeon said quietly, though some older, colder part of him already suspected it was. "It's been buried a long time," Han said. "Whoever filed it wanted it forgotten. I only found it because the Lagos number matched a contact once tied to this case." Do-yeon sat with the folder a long time after Han left, the fire in the hearth burning low, his father's painted eyes seeming to follow him around the room. He thought of every dinner where his father spoke of loyalty, of family, of protecting what was theirs, and wondered now how many buried names that protection had cost. He didn't sleep that night. At dawn, he found Adaze in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, staring out at the garden where this had all begun. "Your brother," Do-yeon said, setting the manifest on the table between them, "worked for my family before we ever met." Adaze's cup trembled slightly against its saucer, the only crack in the composure she'd worn like armor for days. "Where did you get that?" "That's not the question that matters right now." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, the anger in her voice was old, worn smooth by years of carrying it alone. "You don't understand what your father did to him, Do-yeon. You don't understand what it cost my family to survive what your empire calls business. Then tell me. All of it. No more half-truths passed to me in whispers I have to chase down myself." Her eyes searched his face as if testing whether he could survive what she was about to hand him. Then, slowly, she began, "Emeka worked logistics for one of your father's shipping partners in Lagos. He was good at his job, good enough to notice when numbers didn't match what was actually loaded onto the vessels. He asked questions he wasn't supposed to ask. Within a month, he was accused of theft he never committed, stripped of his position, and warned, quietly, the way your family does everything, that if he spoke publicly about what he'd seen, he wouldn't get a second warning." Do-yeon felt something tighten in his chest. "What did he see?" "I don't know all of it. He never told me everything. He said it was safer if I didn't know. But I know he ran. I know he's been moving between cities for 2 years, changing numbers every few months, only calling when it's safe enough to risk it. That call in the garden wasn't a stranger, Do-yeon. It was my brother, terrified, checking if I was still alive to answer." The silence between them stretched long enough that the tea in her cup went fully cold. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, not with anger, but with something closer to grief. "Because for 2 years," she said, "I didn't know if the man asking was my husband or a Choi." Do-yeon sat with her answer long after she left the room, staring at the manifest until the ink blurred. For the first time since the phone rang at 11:47 p.m., he understood that the danger circling his marriage hadn't come from his wife's hidden past at all. It had come from his own family's hands, buried 2 years deep in a ledger no one was ever supposed to read. And somewhere in Lagos, a man who shared her blood was still running from a name Do-yeon had carried his entire life without ever asking what it truly cost. The truth, once it started, refused to stop at the edges Adaise had drawn for it. She found him again that night in the study, the manifest still open on the desk, and this time she didn't wait for him to ask. She sat across from him, hands folded, and told him the part of the story she'd rehearsed leaving out for 3 years. "I met you at the Seoyeon Foundation Gala," she said. "You remember it as chance." It wasn't. Not entirely. I'd learned the Choi name from Amika's case files months before. I recognized it the moment I saw it on the guest list. I went that night knowing exactly whose company I was walking into. Do-yeon's jaw tightened, though he made himself stay still, stay listening. "So you sought me out." "I did." She didn't flinch from it. I told myself if I could get close to the family, I might find a way to help him. Evidence, a name, anything that could clear him without costing him his life. That was the plan. That was the only plan. In the beginning. And somewhere along the way, for the first time, her composure cracked into something softer. Somewhere along the way, the plan stopped mattering. "I fell in love with you, Do-yeon. Not the name, not the company, not the leverage I thought I might find. You. The man who remembered how I liked my tea before I'd told him twice. The man who canceled a board meeting because I had a fever. That part was never a performance. I need you to believe that, even if you can't forgive the rest of it yet." Do-yeon stood and walked to the window, hands pressed against the frame, his back to her. The garden below was empty, the same stone path where he'd first heard her whispering into a phone he didn't recognize. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years of marriage, and I'm only now learning why you said yes. You're learning why I said yes to meeting you, she corrected gently. Not why I stayed. I stayed because somewhere in the first year, this stopped being about Emika and started being about us. But I was afraid that if you knew the beginning, you'd never believe the middle was real. He turned back to face her, and for a long moment neither spoke. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a dim, uncertain light that matched exactly how he felt. "I need something from you," he finally said. "Not an apology. Not more explanation. I need you to stop carrying this alone. If your brother is in danger because of my family's name, then my family's name is going to be the thing that gets him out. Properly, legally, permanently. No more shadows. No more numbers that change every few months." Adaise's eyes filled, though she held the tears back with the same discipline that had carried her through 2 years of secrecy. "You do that? Even knowing it means exposing your own father?" "Especially because it means that," Do-yeon said. "I built my life believing loyalty to this family meant silence. I'm done paying for that belief with people who never deserved to disappear in the first place." For the first time since the phone rang in the garden, Adaise let herself hope that the truth, once fully spoken, might not cost her the one thing she'd never planned on gaining: a husband who chose her even after learning exactly how their story began. But hope, in the Choi household, rarely arrived unchallenged. Neither of them knew that in a room 2 floors below, Do-yeon's father had already learned the calls from Lagos had resumed, and that his son was asking questions about a manifest that was never supposed to resurface. By morning, the old man would make it clear that some secrets, in his eyes, were worth protecting at any cost, even if the price was his own son's marriage. The confrontation happened in the same office where, 2 years earlier, the cover-up had first been signed into existence. A room of dark wood, cold marble, and old portraits, built to make every conversation inside it feel less like a family matter and more like a hostile negotiation. Do-yeon had walked into that office as a boy 100 times, watching his father close deals with the same calm, unreadable expression he now recognized as something closer to menace than composure. He had never once imagined walking into it as an adversary. His father was already seated when he arrived, hands folded over the desk, a single folder placed neatly in front of him. Not the manifest, Do-yun realized, but something else entirely. A quiet warning that his father had prepared for this conversation long before Do-yun had. "You went through the old shipping files," his father said. It wasn't a question. It never was, with him. "You buried a man's life to protect a manifest," Do-yun replied, standing rather than taking the chair across from him, a small refusal, but one his father noticed instantly. "I want to hear you deny it." His father didn't deny it. He didn't even blink. "Emeka Obi knew too much for a man in his position," he said, his voice level, almost bored, as though explaining a routine logistics decision rather than the destruction of a man's life. "Some men who learn too much don't get to walk away and stay quiet forever. I made sure he disappeared instead of talking. That was mercy, Do-yun." The alternative on the table at the time was considerably worse for everyone involved, including him. "He's my wife's brother." "Then perhaps," his father said, cold and unblinking, "you married into the consequences of this family's survival, and now you resent the price instead of thanking me for the empire it bought you." Something in Do-yun went very quiet at that. Not the quiet of retreat, but the quiet of a decision finally settling into place. He had spent 3 decades believing that protecting the Choi name meant absorbing whatever damage his father created and calling it loyalty. He had watched his father bury inconvenient truths the way other men buried garbage, efficiently, without ceremony, without a second thought for what was lost in the process. He was finished being a willing part of that machinery. "I've spoken to the board," Do-yun said quietly. 3 of them, actually. Director Song, Director Bayek, and your old friend, Chairman Yeo, who apparently has held a grudge against you since the Busan acquisition fell through in your favor, and not his. His father's expression shifted for the first time. Not fear exactly, but the beginning of it. "What have you done?" "I've done what you taught me to do. I built leverage quietly, over almost a year, without you noticing the ground shifting beneath you. I have enough proxy support to remove you from operational control by end of week. The vote is already scheduled. You would destroy this family over a dock worker from Lagos." "I would save this family," Do-yun said, "from becoming a company built entirely on the bodies of people we decided didn't matter enough to protect." His father said nothing further. There was nothing further to say. Men like him, Do-yun had learned, only respected power. And for the first time, Do-yun held more of it than he did. The board vote, 3 days later, was swift and largely silent, the way significant power shifts inside old Korean conglomerates so often were. No headlines, no public scandal, simply a quiet reallocation of authority disguised in the language of restructuring for future growth. Do-yun's father retained his title, his office, his portrait on the wall. But the real authority, the signing power, the operational control, the ability to bury another manifest ever again, passed to his son. It wasn't clean. It wasn't without cost. Relationships that had taken decades to build cracked overnight. Men who had once called Do-yun's father brother in business now avoided his calls entirely, sensing correctly which way the wind inside Choi Holdings had turned. But it was, for the first time in Do-yun's adult life, entirely his own decision, made without needing anyone's permission or forgiveness. With his newly consolidated authority, Do-yun's first act was not a press release, not a shareholder memo, but a single phone call to his legal team, instructing them to formally reopen the manifest case, this time under his own name, his own signature, his own terms. The false theft accusation against Emeka Obi was reviewed line by line, the falsified entries identified and corrected, the original discrepancy properly attributed to the shipping partner who had actually manipulated the cargo records 2 years earlier. Emeka's name was cleared through the company's own restructured internal review, quietly and permanently, with protections built specifically around his safety and his return. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after the board vote. Adais answered her phone in the same garden where all of this had started. Not in a whisper this time, not glancing over her shoulder for a husband she had once feared might not understand, might not forgive, might choose his father's name over her brother's life. She answered it standing beside Do-Yun in full daylight, her voice breaking with a relief 3 years in the making as her brother's voice came through clearly, steadily, for the first time since he'd fled Lagos. "Adaize," Emeka said, and she nearly dropped the phone at the sound of her own name spoken without fear attached to it. "It's done. They cleared it. I can come home." She wept as she spoke to him, not the careful, contained tears of a woman managing a secret, but the full, unguarded release of someone finally allowed to feel the weight she'd carried alone for 2 years. Do-Yun stood beside her without interrupting, without needing to be part of the moment, simply present, his hand steady on her back. When she finally lowered the phone, wiping her face, Do-Yun was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not suspicion, not the careful calculation of a man gathering evidence, but something quieter and more permanent. "He's coming to Seoul," she said. "Next month. He wants to meet you properly this time. Not as a name on a manifest." "I'd like that," Do-Yun said, and meant it. They stood together in the garden a while longer, the evening settling gold and quiet around them. The same stone path where suspicion had first taken root, now simply a path, nothing more. Adais thought of the girl who had walked into a charity gala 2 years ago with a plan and a folder of case files memorized by heart, and marveled at how little that plan had prepared her for what actually happened. A real marriage, real love, built accidentally on top of a calculated risk. "No more secrets," Do-Yun said finally, taking her hand the way he had that very first night, though everything about the gesture felt different now, lighter, chosen rather than uncertain. "No more secrets," she echoed, laughing through the last of her tears. "Just us. Choosing each other again, this time with absolutely nothing left hidden between us. The Choi Empire would face its own reckonings in the months ahead." Whispers moved quickly through Seoul's business circles, that the elder Choi's quiet removal from operational power was no ordinary restructuring, that a young heir had orchestrated something far more significant than a routine board vote, and that somewhere beneath the official language of future growth sat a story about a Nigerian dockworker. A buried manifest, and a marriage that had begun as a strategy and ended as something no one, least of all Adais herself, had planned to find. But that evening, in the garden where it had all started, none of that mattered yet. Adais answered a call from her brother in front of her husband, in the light, without a single word left unspoken between them. And for the first time in 3 years of marriage, she smiled without anything left to hide. Some in Seoul's business circles whispered that the elder Choi's removal was only the beginning, that Emeka's cleared testimony had opened a door leading straight into deals far larger and far more dangerous than a single buried shipment. Whether Do-Yun was ready to walk through it himself, and whether the family he'd inherited could survive what came next, no one, not even his wife, could yet say.